Hey guys, welcome back to the David Mathas podcast. I'm your host, David Mathas, and I have a very special guest today, Dr. Sam Buckner, who is actually a former professor of mine from my master's program at USF. One of the smartest guys I know when it comes to how to build muscle and how to get strong. This is kind of his wheelhouse. We're going to talk a little bit about blood flow restriction training, what are the mechanisms of strength training, hypertrophy training and stuff. But Dr. Buckner, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So what else do people need to know about you? You're obviously a professor at USF. Where did you do your PhD from?
University of Mississippi. I was a rebel for a while. I guess a land shark now. They're the land sharks now.
Oh, they changed.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
I don't know how I missed that, but you're still a rebel.
Yeah, it feels like I think everyone always says it's "Go Rebels." That's what everyone says.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and I didn't catch that. I mean, obviously there's all this PC stuff going around now and everything, but
yeah.
I missed that one. So, okay. So you are from Ole Miss. Obviously you did your PhD there under Dr. Leneke, correct?
Yeah.
Yep.
Exactly.
So what would you say your wheelhouse is when it comes to training? You did a lot of like blood flow restriction research there.
I think if I were to describe what I'm interested in and kind of, I guess, the aims of the USF Muscle Lab, we want to explore various ways to make muscle grow. One of those techniques that we employ is blood flow restriction, and other low load or no load alternatives to traditional resistance training, in a way to understand how we can train for growth and also to help understand to some extent, and we have limited capabilities, but I want to know why muscles grow and mechanistically, and I want to know what is the purpose of growth, and we use imaging techniques, specifically ultrasound, to capture those growth adaptations. So yeah, I love training. I always have. That kind of drove my passion when I got into science, and learning how and why muscles grow is just, it's a really cool thing that's what I do for a living.
It's awesome. I mean, that's why most of us go through that program, is to try to figure out how do we get bigger and stronger, right? That's the main goal. For those guys that aren't following him on Instagram or anything, it's just at Samuel Buckner, right?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's it. Just my name.
He was a gymnast growing up, and he does, I don't know if you still do it, but he used to do some crazy gymnastic stuff.
Yeah, I don't have as much time these days, but I, at least once or twice a week, I go to the gym and I test myself.
Yeah.
To make sure I still got it. And once a semester, I'll go for some type of not a world record anymore, but still see if I can push the envelope on my own ability. So it makes it fun and interesting.
It's impressive, I'll tell you that.
Thanks.
Okay, so obviously we touched on blood flow restriction. For people that are listening that might not know what blood flow restriction is, I think a lot of people that are listening to this are probably into training. They've probably heard about it. How would you describe blood flow restriction training?
Yeah, so blood flow restriction training is when you apply a tourniquet, a pneumatic cuff, a strap, a knee wrap to the most proximal portion of either your arms or your legs. You apply basically pressure, and this pressure is going to limit blood flow to your limb, right, to your arms or your legs. And it's going to largely occlude or stop venous blood flow out of your limb. So you're trapping blood distal to that cuff, and you're altering the environment within that muscle. So I guess a simple way to explain it is, when you train, you'll get this burning sensation, right? You're fatiguing, you're building up metabolites. Well, when you apply a cuff, that cuff is kind of exacerbating that, right? So when you train, you normally clear those metabolites and you don't feel that bad. If you trap them, they're accumulating,
Right,
and facilitating fatigue.
So guys, if you're watching this on YouTube, on my arm, you would put it kind of like right under your shoulder, kind of right above at the top of your bicep. That's what he means by proximal and everything. So If you guys are listening to this on iTunes, go check out the YouTube video. All right, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, so you're applying it to the top of your arms or top of your legs. You're inflating it to, our lab always suggests a lower pressure, so you don't need really high pressures. And you lift lighter weight than you perhaps typically would. So in the literature, you'll often see 30% of 1 RM.
Mhm.
So it's a weight that if you picked up that weight, you can probably do 30 repetitions with it, and you're going to reach failure.
Right.
Now, traditional growth recommendations is to lift 70%, right? Which puts you in that 8 to 12 rep range.
Yeah.
That's how most people train for growth. Now, when you lift a lightweight, you can do a lot more repetitions, and low loads without blood flow restriction are very effective for inducing skeletal muscle growth.
Mhm.
So I suppose the question someone would ask is, well, why would I add pressure on top of that?
Right.
And what the BFR allows you to do, it allows you to fatigue that muscle more quickly,
Mhm.
right? So my view of muscle growth is one that, to make a muscle grow, you need to contract that muscle, and you need to reach sufficient activation and fatigue of that muscle. So if it's fatigued, it's probably going to grow. And if you picked up, so David, if you picked up a 20-pound, 15-pound dumbbell, 20-pound dumbbell, and you had no blood flow restriction, let's say you could do 35 reps.
Right.
If you then applied blood flow restriction, you could only do 20 reps. So what BFR did is it reduced the amount of volume you have to perform to
Yeah.
get that same adaptation.
It's kind
And
of
the reason,
equivalent of like what HIIT cardio did to steady state cardio, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
it's a
Good
similar
analogy.
idea. And there's and what it's essentially doing, like I mentioned, you're reducing blood flow into the muscle,
Mhm.
right? But you're really trapping those metabolites. So when you contract your muscle uses ATP, it's an energy currency,
Mhm.
and the metabolism creates various metabolic byproducts, right, which cause fatigue.
Right.
And when you trap them in the muscle and don't let them leave, it becomes much harder to continue to produce force. So basically, you're making that process just occur a little bit quicker.
So what would be like a typical BFR training protocol? Like
Um,
sets and reps and time and all that?
yeah, so if someone wanted to start incorporating BFR into their training, um, first of all, you should train with lighter weight.
Mhm.
There's actually a study that came out last week looking at lifting heavy and using BFR either during the exercise or during the rest, and it was not effective. So there's really there's no reason to restrict blood flow if you're lifting heavy weights,
Okay.
to my knowledge.
Right.
So you want to implement it in combination with lighter weights. And the kind of most common protocol in the literature is 4 sets of exercise
Mhm.
with 20 to 30% of your 1 RM. And on the first set, a lot of times what we see is a set of 30 repetitions followed by 3 sets of 15. Um, and that was just kind of what early research employed. They used that protocol.
Yeah.
In the past 3 to 5 years, it would be more common to see a recommendation of just do 3 to 4 sets to failure.
Well, see,
Um,
that's interesting because obviously I remember the 30, 15, 15 from what we learned, in the program and stuff, but I hadn't heard about those new recommendations as far as just doing 4 sets to failure.
Now the 30, 15, 15, 15 it's a perfectly okay recommendation. The reason that recommendation is typically fine is because most people are failing at least by sets 2, 3, 4, if they employ this protocol.
Right.
So, sometimes it's nice to have goal repetitions,
Hmm.
but if you pick a lightweight and you apply pressure to your arms or legs and you get nowhere near 30 repetitions with 30%, you can assume, okay, the weight might be too heavy, or the pressure in this cuff or the strap I have wrapped around my limb is too tight.
Yeah.
So
Because
I
I
like
think,
to
I think
use,
something we'll get into in a little bit is how do you get stronger and how do you build muscle, right? And strength is a skill. Strength
Yeah.
is the skill, which I know, that's one of the things you like to say a lot that I learned from you. But that person might have more of or less of a skill to lift heavier weight, or more of a skill to lift heavier weight, meaning they might fatigue maybe a little bit sooner or a little bit later. Kind of, does that make?
Yeah. And there's a lot of variances. So if you take two people with the same absolute strength
Mhm.
and you tell them both to lift, let's just say they're lifting 70%, one person might do 4 reps and one person might do 12 reps, even though their absolute 1 RM strength is the same.
Right.
So that's why the recommendation of 2 or near failure is a little bit safer than just an absolute reps,
Yeah.
because if you did 30 reps, but you had the capability of doing 60, you didn't get the most out of that set of exercise because you're far from failing and you're far from activating all of the musculature. Does that
Right.
make sense?
Yeah. So basically, you want to push it as close to failure as possible. So failure is the one of the main indicators of potential growth. Correct.
I believe so. It's not absolutely necessary, but you need to be close.
Yeah.
Uh, I think if you want that insurance that you're stimulating growth, you want to be going to or at least near failure.
What I like to tell my clients is about within 2 reps of failure. Is that
Yeah.
good indication? Do you know something different? I mean, I think that if you're picking a weight and you're challenging yourself within 2 reps of failure, I think that you're limiting that potential plateauing and overdoing it, but you're still providing enough stimulus. Do you agree?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
In research, a lot of people, I think, because you'll see a lot of debates on don't train to failure. You know you're going to accumulate too much fatigue. Um, I think a lot of those are taking the scientific literature as direct recommendations,
Mhm.
where we use that more as a way to make sure that stimulus is effective to see what we're trying to see in research. But the takeaway from that literature base would be somewhere close to it.
Yeah.
And if you're
I think
two, three reps away,
I think you see like people that are the ones that make the real progress that they want to make. They're not they're not thinking about, oh, I've got to stop here because I don't want to overdo it, right? They're taking things, they're pushing themselves to failure. And I think it's, in a way, I almost think that as much as you and I love research and we love science and everything, I think people get too caught up in it sometimes and they
yeah,
forget to just train, just work themselves hard, eat, recover, rest, and go at it again. I just find so many people, they don't even know if the study that they're reading applies to their particular circumstance. They just hear, oh, I can't trade a failure. Well, you don't know what the population is in this. You don't know what the circumstances are, all that stuff.
yeah,
So that's where I kind of, with my clients, when I sign them up, I tell them, I kind of take science and I take you and I kind of mesh you together and we find
yeah,
a happy place there. And
yeah.
just, being a part of research and everything for so many years there, it's just like, you can get caught up in the nuances so much and forget that it doesn't apply to every single person.
Yeah, it gives us guiding principles and it helps us understand how physiology works.
Hmm.
And that's why we know, for example, high loads to failure, low loads to failure, low loads of BFR, they all cause similar growth,
Yeah.
because across an exercise set, all of these things are able to activate the bulk of the musculature involved in the movement,
Right.
right? So I think another way, if for the listeners to maybe help understand this, you know, if you lift a 50 pound, that's my what's a good bicep curl weight?
Yeah. For
35
those of you that
pound.
don't know, he has crazy bicep curl strength. Like it's ridiculous, kind of actually. But
Yeah,
I would say, say 35, 40, maybe.
35, 40. Yeah. So you pick up a 35-pound dumbbell, right? And it takes 8 reps. You squeeze out a ninth rep and you fatigue that muscle, right?
Right.
You do that 4 times, your muscle is going to grow. If you then pick up a 20-pound dumbbell, you know, if you did the same amount of reps, you've only activated, let's say, 50% of the muscle involved in that movement. You've fatigued 50% of the muscle involved in that movement.
Mhm.
You have to take that weight all the way up to 40 reps to fatigue the same amount of muscle, to turn on the same amount of muscle, to
Right.
tell the same amount of muscle to grow. Now, if you add BFR in, you're going to start fatiguing more quickly. So now with that same 20-pound weight, you do, let's say, 25 reps instead of 40
Mhm.
and get the same amount of activation and fatigue. So we reach the same endpoint 3 different ways,
Right.
right? And they all have a similar outcome and a similar effect over time. You're turning on signaling proteins within your fibers that are telling your fibers get bigger, grow,
Yeah.
right? It's a hypertrophic stimulus.
Now, I think that's a good indication that there's 3 different ways you just talked about as far as, stimulating muscle and building muscle. Just goes to show that there's not just one perfect way to do almost anything, right?
Yeah.
Now, I'm one that I like to train a little bit lower volume, heavier and like higher intensity, things like that. I know a lot of people like to train higher volume, lower intensity, things like that. So basically, what I'm gathering from you is that pick whatever you are going to be able to enjoy and sustain and stick to it, correct?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so.
Science, the research doesn't show that there's a whole lot of difference either way, as long
Yeah,
as you're getting close to failure.
yeah, there's probably some groups that would have debates,
Yeah.
and there's very limited evidence that's not convincing to me, where some have suggested that you could get preferential type 1 muscle fibers. So the more aerobic type, the smaller fibers, you can get more growth out of those if you're using these lighter weights to failure.
Hmm.
That data is not really compelling to me,
Okay.
but I always tell people, if you want that insurance policy, mix in a little low load to failure with
Yeah.
your lifting of heavy weights. And
And I
is
think
it gonna
periodization and undulating periodization if we have some time and stuff too. But as far as like just going back real quick to the BFR, either the 30, 15, 15, 15 or 4 sets to failure, how much rest time in between should someone take? And are they supposed to leave the BFR straps or whatever they're using? Are they supposed to leave that on the entire time?
that's a great question. So um, you apply the pressure at the beginning, right? Do your 4 sets, leave it on during the rest,
Mhm.
and then relieve yourself of that pressure after you finish the last set of exercise.
So don't leave it
I
on
guess
the
you
entire workout.
don't leave it on the entire workout. You want to keep it on for, maybe you decide you want to do 1 to 2 exercises, which I think is fine.
Yeah.
But you keep it on for that duration. Don't deflate it during the rest. The rest is going to be the most uncomfortable time, because normally during your rest, you're recovering, right? When you apply pressure, you're trying to recover, but those metabolites are stuck, right? Some of them are leaving, but they're largely just um, kind of bathing that muscle. And what happens is, when you start that second set of exercise, rather than being recovered, you're still fatigued.
Yeah.
So it's like starting maybe 10 reps in already.
Yeah, it's like when,
That's the
when you're
best.
working out, you expect to feel some burn, right? But then you know kind of in your head, oh, okay, I'm gonna rest here in a minute. It's gonna go away. It doesn't really go away so much with BFR, but that's also
Yeah.
the beauty of shorter workout periods, things like that too. So, what sort of populations would benefit most? I know the answer, just obviously knowing you and going through the class. But what populations have you seen that could really benefit the most from BFR training?
Yeah, I suppose it's a question of, you know, what do we mean by benefits? So I think most healthy people and even some clinical populations can implement BFR
Mhm.
and perfectly justify it. People recovering from injury who can't lift heavy, it might be more important for those individuals because they literally do not have the capability of lifting a heavy weight.
Right.
And people who, yeah, my little brother had ACL, PCL, he had everything.
I remember
But
that.
he was, yeah, he was a mess. And in his PT, they were using BFR,
Hmm.
lifting some very lightweight. just some band work, applying BFR to give that muscle more of a stimulus.
Right.
I don't know what your viewership is, but I'm guessing they're more of a strength and hypertrophy type athlete.
Yeah,
And
I think that, and I think that just general health in
yeah,
general, for lack of a better
just
term, they enjoy
powerlifting
working out. They want to be healthy. They want to
yeah,
figure out the most effective way to build muscle and burn fat.
yeah. I so it's funny because for the longest time I didn't use BFR personally.
Mhm.
And people automatic sometimes I think they get the impression that if you study something, if you're the researcher of BFR, then you're an advocate for it. I'm not an advocate for anything other than data,
Right.
and I have my own preferences for what I like to lift. However, and I think I shared with class, I typically do. I have a hard time fatiguing my triceps for whatever reason, and it's one of those exercises where I'll go full stack and I'll do reps and I feel like I'm there all day. So I like doing BFR with my triceps because
Right.
I feel like I can be more time efficient. I can go into the gym.
That's
Maybe you look a little bit funny having those cuffs on your arms, but 4 sets, I feel very fatigued and I've accomplished what I want to accomplish in a very time efficient manner.
hey, some of the stuff I see people do with Bosu balls, don't feel embarrassed or feel weird about putting straps in there, okay? 'Cause there's plenty of people in there that look a lot a lot more ridiculous, and I think it's gaining obviously a lot more popularity. I see it a little bit more often, things like that.
Yeah.
Um, how frequent should someone do it? Is it okay to do it every work? Like if you always, for your triceps, for example, right? If every time you go in to work triceps, is it okay to do it? Should you do it once a week to a body part? Do you know any data on that as far as the frequency?
I don't know that I would treat the frequency of implementing BFR any different than I would any other exercise.
Okay.
Um, it's very low damage, if any,
Yeah.
compared to lifting really heavy. So in that sense, you might be able to craft an argument where you could employ it more frequently. The first few times you implement BFR, you're going to have more soreness in the days following.
Yeah.
And that soreness does not mean damage, right? We know that we can have soreness and there not be actual structural damage present.
Right.
But the first few times you implement it, you're gonna feel it. Um, but as long as you're feeling like you can train again, I don't know that we would treat that any differently. Um, I and maybe you're coming at it from a safety standpoint. From a safety standpoint, BFR, it seems like a very safe exercise stimulus.
I think
Um,
I was kind of thinking it more towards like increasing blood pressure more and more like
yeah,
health purposes from that, not so much from the like damage or anything to the muscle, just more
yeah.
like the health markers. Is there any evidence to show that it significantly increases blood pressure to an unsafe point?
I not to my knowledge. So there was a letter to the editor by Marty Spranger, talking about the exercise pressor reflex. So what that is for your audience, when you exercise, you produce metabolites, and our body is constantly communicating with with the brain and the cardiovascular control center. And when you have metabolites pulling in your muscle, your body wants to fix that, right? It wants to restore homeostasis. So you increase blood pressure to try to get fresh oxygenated blood to the muscle.
Hmm.
So yes, there's going to be an increase in blood pressure, but to my knowledge, the blood pressures that we see during BFR are, I would say, probably still lower than those that are seen lifting heavy weights,
Oh, okay. So
right?
that was gonna be my question: is any sort of comparison to just people doing high intensity, low volume without BFR? So that's really interesting. So it's more of just that general acute high blood pressure that you're always going to get during training.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I would say it's more of a question of, does an individual have um, they talk to the physician, are they cleared for exercise, right? Do they have any contraindications for various types of exercise, right? But, if you remember, one of the coolest things we looked at in cardiovascular was the fact that during leg press, when you're pushing the stack of weight,
Yeah.
blood pressure gets up to 500 millimeters of mercury for some people.
Yeah.
It's a
I
quick
remember that chart.
spike,
Yeah.
right? When you do a bicep curl, your blood pressure gets up to 230, 250, right?
Yeah.
When you do it, like we looked at all these different exercises, and we don't think about stress in the cardiovascular system,
Mhm.
but I don't think this stress is a negative thing, right?
Right.
It is an acute stress to the cardiovascular system, which I think exercise is always going to present an acute stress on both the muscle and the cardiovascular system.
That's how we
And
adapt and grow, is through stress.
yeah, yeah. So I don't think it would be viewed as a bad or dangerous thing, but there probably are some people who are at an elevated risk, and they have to have more caution in general when approaching exercise.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that
if
makes
that
sense.
makes sense.
That makes sense. So, we talked a little bit. I think we were probably already off. We were off camera when we talked about it, but strength being a skill, right?
Yeah.
So, a lot of times people don't understand that training for hypertrophy and training for strength aren't necessarily the same thing, right?
Yeah.
Now, can training for strength produce hypertrophy? Absolutely. Vice versa, right? But training for hypertrophy is more going to increase your lower intensity strength, right? Like you said, the 6 to 12 rep range, right? But if we're talking powerlifting, we're talking, strongman, maximal lifting, things like that, your 1 rep max. How are the two different? How should your approaches be different with the two? And what are sort of the mechanisms for strength gain and the mechanisms for hypertrophy?
Okay. So the training scenario you provided, David, we're training for like a powerlifting style,
Yeah, like the
maximum
1 rep
1RM
max. Yep.
versus
Just
what's the versus?
just bodybuilding. Just
Okay.
yep.
Um, so yeah, well, I guess we'll start with bodybuilding, and then we'll transition to the strength, because then we can show the differences in the approaches to the training.
Yeah.
Um, with everything we spoke about, for growth, we know that we could take that low load to failure. We
Mhm.
could take that low load of BFR to failure. We could take that 70% of 1RM to failure. All of those are going to produce the same growth. However, when you lift low loads to failure, the strength you're going to improve is your ability to perform repetitions with a low load. That's specificity, right? So the thing you're probably getting the best at with each of those types of training is the person who did 70%, the thing they're getting better at is performing reps with 70% of their 1RM. And they're going to have some of that transfer to their maximum strength, their 1RM strength, right? The low load training, sometimes training with 30% of 1RM, despite having the same growth, will not lead to a change in maximum 1RM strength. So, if you did 30% of 1RM, you can grow and maybe even reach your potential for growth, but you'd be a very weak person, right?
You're not gonna be winning any powerlifting meets with that.
Yeah, when the standard is maximum 1RM strength.
Mhm.
So this demonstrates the importance for specificity in our training, right? So if you're a power lifter, the most important thing for a power lifter is 1RM performance, right? So I think an argument can be made that they need to have exposure to lifting those heavy weights, to
Mhm.
practicing that skill. And I think that training looks very low volume, right? And maybe you want to, I mean, you can't lift heavy all the time, right? It may not, it's perhaps just not realistic.
I think a lot
So
of people only think about like your muscles recovering, right? But like the higher you get closer to your 1 rep max, the more toll it takes on your central nervous system. And then also your joints and ligaments take a beating too.
yeah. And then just there's a confidence factor too. There's a psychological component here where if you were just doing low volume, you may not have developed that confidence you need under the bar,
So true.
right? So I think you just need this, you need some volume days. I don't think volume is incredibly important. I don't think chasing maximum growth is that important, but I think you need practice in that movement, like prioritizing lifting heavy, right? Maybe doubles, triples,
Yeah.
um, and then maybe some days where you're doing just volume training, but not too much volume training, and making sure you're tapering that as you enter season and focusing less on volume,
Yeah. I
right?
think if anyone has been training like, you know, higher volume, lower intensity stuff, um, if you go up and try to do a 1 rep max and you've been training that way, you should be scared shitless at that point. I mean,
Yeah,
that's a huge, it's almost like the equivalent of moving from like the middle of the desert up to Alaska in the middle of the winter time, right? Like you're just not
yeah,
going to be exposed to it and everything. And, you know, that's why it's really important to be aware and be focused on what is your main goal, right? Because, you
yeah,
know, I don't know if we'll really get into concurrent training and all this stuff. If that might be a whole nother podcast to get into and stuff. But I have a lot of people that come to me and they're like, I want to do this and this, right? But it's going to LA and New York at the same time. It's two completely different directions. And so listen, that's great. You can work on getting stronger at the same time as trying to build muscle. Are you going to maximize your top end strength? No, you're not. Are you going to maximize your muscle building potential? No, you're not. So it's really important to go into very clear distinctions as far as what your main goal is. And you know, maybe that's a good segue into periodization. Um, you know, I know we talked a lot about periodization in the
yeah.
program and stuff. Um, in your definition, what is periodization? Because I think I remember that you had a good alternative definition to periodization based off of a paper that we read.
Yeah. Um, I think I have a few of my proposed definitions here, because this is always, this is a wormhole, right?
Oh, so
Um,
so much
but
so.
I really enjoy this area of discussion and conversation, and I think it's incredibly important.
Yeah.
So before I give the definition, um, I think one thing that's important to maybe talk about is what people perceive as periodization.
Hmm.
And what people perceive as periodization is, for example, there might be a study where for 6 weeks, one group does 3 sets of 6 reps. They
Yeah.
do that same thing for 6 weeks, right? And the other group does 3 sets of 10 for the first 3 weeks, 2 sets of 5, and then 3 sets of 3. So they increase the weight and decrease the reps. They do something different
Hmm.
versus a group that does the same thing over time. That's what most people perceive as periodization. And what I call that is, does variation in your programming make something, quote, periodized? And what I view periodization as, actually, when you review the definitions, not the way we've studied it, these are two different things. You find that it's just managing stress, right? It's the balance of all the stressors in the life, and it was developed in the context of sport, right? So the initial goal of periodization was, when you're playing football a lot, you cannot lift weights a lot, right? Because you're spending too much time in your sport to spend a lot of time lifting weights.
Makes
So
sense.
what you would naturally do is, over a season, you would decrease time or volume lifting weights as you increased your time playing football,
Right.
right? So in the context of sport, periodization was created to achieve balance of stressors,
Okay.
right? Fast forward 30, 40 years, it's become fancy variation in programming versus non-fancy variation in programming.
Yeah.
I think these are two different things. And often when we have discussions on periodization, um, I think we have to consider which version are we talking about. And this area of research and discussion is very messy right now. I'll hear podcasts where they start the podcast by distinguishing between periodization and programming,
Hmm.
and then go on to have 2 hours of discussion on periodization where they only discuss programming, right? So my
Yeah.
definition, I think our lab came out with a paper recently. We say periodization is an organizational approach to training that considers the competing stressors within an athlete's life
Okay.
and creates periods of time dedicated to specific outcomes. So a period of time for hypertrophy, a period of time for strength. These designated periods are intended to manage the stress of exercise while also creating potentiation in the subsequent training phases. Through proper stress management and program design, this approach may also attempt to peak performance at a specific time relevant to competition.
Okay. I like
So
that.
that's my newest definition, David. And we wrote a paper called Periodization, Variation in the Definition and Discrepancies in Study Design. And we basically looked at 150 different definitions of periodization to come up with our one definition.
That's just crazy that there's that many different definitions of it. I mean, that just goes to show you how broad this whole topic is, and how, training is there's so much variation into training,
Yeah,
how you can go achieve a goal and stuff like that. That's nuts.
but I know I got us way off track. If we could
Okay.
go back to your point, periodization in the context of trying to get good at two different things, right? If you want to be a good powerlifter and you want to be a good aerobic athlete, you need to focus on what you care about, because once you're training for both, you have competing stressors,
Hmm.
right? And once you have competing stressors, I would imagine you're not going to be the best aerobic athlete, you're not going to be the best powerlifter. And I think in that context, there could be a discussion of periodization, because it's the balance
Hmm.
of our ability to adapt to these two very different things, right?
Yeah, you said the word stressor, which I think is very important. I think a lot of times when people, maybe they're trying to program for themselves, or even have a coach that's trying to program for them, they're always thinking about volume, intensity, and all that stuff. But I don't see too many people talking about managing your stressors, right? Because that has, in my opinion, that has as much to do with your success as your volume or the intensity you're putting forth towards it, right? Because if you're not able to recover, you're not going to be able to grow or get stronger or anything. And I've done a YouTube video on this before about your body's like a big cup of stress, right? Work stress gets poured in, life stress, relationship, training, and then gets to the very top. You can be in a damn traffic jam and someone cuts you off, and that sends that glass overflowing, right? And it's going to affect all areas of your life. So making sure that you're not overdoing it with the training and controlling your stressors from that way is one way to also help progress in your goals.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you know, there's debate around this area, but periodization was developed from Hans Selye's general adaptation syndrome. Hans Selye was a stress researcher.
Right.
You know, the book he wrote he wrote many, but his two most famous books are The Stress of Life
Yeah.
and Stress Without Distress. And the way he viewed stress is, he said you can only adapt to so much at one given time, right? So if you're trying to get good at 10 different things, you're not going to be very, very good at 10 different things. You're going to spread out your ability to adapt and maybe be mediocre at many different things. And I can think about it many different ways. If I sometimes wonder with gymnastics, I used to be a gymnast, so it's really easy for me to think, if I wanted to just get good at one of the 6 events
Hmm.
and I stopped training the other 5, I think I could be really good as a specialist on one event,
Yeah.
right? Or the same thing with powerlifting. If you didn't train all 3, could you potentially be better at the one lift if you put all of your time and energy and ability to adapt into this one thing? So,
Well, I think that's a really interesting point too, because I think a lot of times people let's use powerlifting, for example. I think it's a great example. you see some people that have amazing squats, right? Or amazing deadlifts, but their bench sucks or their squat sucks, or, something sucks. I think that we tend to gravitate towards putting more effort into the things that we're just naturally good at, right? And that we enjoy. I mean, I think that's one way to talk about those discrepancies is that, obviously the stressors and all that stuff too, but you're going to naturally be better at something you enjoy doing.
Yeah, and if you are predisposed, if you just have the mechanics to be good at this one lift,
Mechanics too, yeah.
you're going to want to do that more, right? You're good at something, you enjoy it, and
Someone with
perhaps
short arms isn't going to be as good at deadlifts as someone with really long arms, right? I mean, you're closer to the bar, you're closer to the center of gravity there and everything, but go ahead.
But yeah, I think it is interesting, and I think when it comes to programming and periodization, I think the stress view of it, David, and this it seems to be kind of how you're thinking, makes a lot more sense than the variation versus non-variation.
Mm-hmm.
And here's what I like to ask people. So in a lot of these studies, they'll compare periodization to something that they say is non-periodized. Well, if you're doing a hypertrophy block and you're just doing sets of 8 to 12 for the entire block,
Mm-hmm.
and you're recovering fine, like, why would you need variation, right?
Exactly.
If that is an effective stress for hypertrophy, what's the purpose of switching it up? If you like switching it up, if there's a psychological benefit, if it's monotonous to you, then there's a reason to switch it up.
You know what? I get into this discussion with clients a lot and stuff too, as far as like, usually my programs last 8 to 12 weeks, somewhere in that range. And they're like, okay, we're on week 7 or week 11. Are we going to change up? And I'm like, well, how's your progress been? Oh, great. Making great progress. Okay, cool. Are you enjoying it? It's kind of boring. Well,
Yeah.
you're making great progress. How is that not exciting? Like, I'm with you in the camp that I don't think you have to change your training up that often. If it's working and you're applying the stimulus, I mean, I don't know who doesn't get excited about seeing progress, right? I don't care if I'm doing the same thing over and over. If I'm progressing, that's pretty damn exciting. So I'm in that camp too, where it's like, we don't have to change things up quite as often. If you've got a movement, horizontal press, a vertical press, a squat, a hip hinge, things like that, if you're making progress in that, and plus I think you have to give yourself quite a bit of time doing the same thing, because that's really the only way you're going to gauge progress. So many people are like, oh, I'm going to squat this block and then I'm going to go to leg press this block. And I'm like, okay, that's great. But if your goal is to increase your squat, right, how are you going to know you're going to increase it unless you just keep progressing in it over time?
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can add to that, I think, another message that gets perpetuated a lot is that as you become more and more advanced, and that you need more variation, right? So if you're a very highly advanced skilled lifter,
Mm-hmm.
variation becomes of higher consequence. And I've seen this argument, it exists both in the industry and in science. And so I'll address my critics, even though it's just us on the podcast. I understand this idea that you need more complex programming as you become more trained, but I think it's trying to chase something that's not going to occur, right? And the reason I think these ideas exist is because as you become trained, it's harder to see gains, right?
Right.
So if you've been lifting for several years, you're not going to get the same growth you got at the beginning.
Yeah.
Right? But
strength.
Yeah, or strength. But what advocates of periodization, when I say periodization, variation, right? Not stress management, but variation in programming, they would suggest that this variation really helps you manage stress, achieve more volume, and get more growth.
Okay.
But if you take a trained person and give them 4 sets to failure, you're going to stimulate, and I would argue maximize muscle protein synthesis, their ability to grow. It has nothing to do with variation, right?
Right.
So I think we've created this idea that variation equals complexity, and complexity is what you need if you're highly trained. And this idea is not based on sound scientific evidence, in my opinion.
So here's my theory on that. It's marketing. I think people try to come up with the most complex things to make themselves sound like they're the smartest people on the face of this earth, when in reality, it's just a marketing scheme. And I think that too many people get into that. Actually, I have a lot of clients that when I give them their training program, they're like, this isn't complex. Like, why does it need to be? Like,
Yeah.
we've got plenty of volume equated for throughout the program. We've got plenty of variation. You're hitting every body part. You're hitting all this stuff. Well, what about tempo? What about drop sets? What about all? Let's make sure you can do this first, right? Before we start getting into that stuff. It's like, I think people because there's so much competition out there with coaches and all this stuff, people have had to resort to making things more complicated than they need to be.
Yeah.
Right? And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring you on here, because I know you think a lot like I do with this, is that you don't have to have complexity. It's not, listen, is it maybe going to add 1% or 2%? Maybe, if all variables are equated for and your genetics allow for it. But like, if your goal is just to build muscle and get stronger, just a simple progression is absolutely fine. Like, you don't have to get, but then from a coaching aspect, obviously I know, people want to know that they're getting their money's worth, right?
Yeah.
They're like, oh, the more complex the program, the more this is worth my money. No,
Yeah.
the more results you get, the more it's worth your money, right? And that's something that I find myself having to compete against with other coaches in the industry, and they're great. I mean, I'm sure they're great programs and stuff too, but it's like, is this necessary for you, right? I mean, I work with athletes, but I mostly work with like general population people, right?
Yeah.
I've got some competitors and things like that, and you have to assess, where are you at? Like, if you're listening to this, you're like, oh, I haven't been working out. I need to start working out again. Well, do you need this super complex program? No, you need to be consistent and have a progressive overload program 4 or 5 days a week in the gym, stay consistent with that. And then we can maybe look into doing something more.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, the complexity sells. I think you need to come up with mathasbolic training. Come up with
you know what? That is I might have to copyright Mathasbolic training. That's a great.
But I see it a lot. I see discussions over things that at the end of the day I don't think matter, right?
Yeah.
An example that comes to mind is like rest periods. Should I have long rest periods or short rest periods? And this one's a very easy discussion for me. If you take short rest periods, you're taking more advantage of metabolites, so you won't have to do as many reps. You get growth. If you take longer rest periods, you're taking less advantage of the metabolic. As long as you're still training to failure, you get growth. They lead to the same thing, right? But we often get stuck in these, well, this is a metabolic technique, so it's more advanced. No, it's just, these are two ways to get to the same endpoint, right?
Yeah.
And there's a million different other comparisons we can come up with, which are the same exact thing. It's two ways to reach the same thing. But if one seems to be taking advantage of a slightly different mechanism, we all of a sudden assign more importance to that, right? Or vice versa. If one allows us to do more volume, we think it's automatically better because it allows us to do more volume, right? But metabolites can allow you to do less, so take advantage of it.
Yeah, there is no perfect amount of volume or a perfect intensity or rep scheme. That I tell people all the time, the volume that you should be doing and the rep scheme you should be doing is, and the frequency also of how much you train, is going to greatly depend and solely depend, I think, on how well you recover, right? So you may, I guess this is an interesting question. What are your thoughts on like daily undulating periodization?
So
for people that don't know that, it's like you're doing like maybe one day of the week you're doing low volume, higher intensity, right? And the next day you're doing higher volume, lower intensity. It's changing up your rep schemes throughout the week?
So I guess the first thing I'll say is I think daily undulating periodization, I think people are now calling it daily undulating programming, right? Because it
Sure.
would fall into the category as programming, not periodization.
Right.
But basically, you know, a lot of the early models, what would they do? They would do 3 days a week, and it would be hypertrophy, strength, power, or a different iteration where you switch the order.
Right.
Now, if I do an 8-week training block,
Hmm.
I think what do I want to achieve? So if I want to achieve growth, I would have no undulation. I would have hypertrophy, hypertrophy, hypertrophy,
Right.
right?
Absolutely.
If I wanted to, so then there would be no undulation. Now you could implement a heavier day, 8 to 12, a low load day. Maybe you consider that an undulation. But I would say like daily undulating periodization or programming, whatever we want to call it, it's it's assuming that these workouts, like that strength is enhancing hypertrophy and hypertrophy is enhancing strength.
Yeah.
Thus, in a training block, you need to train all of these different aspects of strength, of growth and performance. And I don't subscribe to that. So since I don't think you need strength in a hypertrophy block,
Hmm.
I don't think you need daily undulating periodization.
I think that I think people that really, really fall in love with the idea of daily undulating periodization are the ones that, if you guys are listening and you're one that falls into this, don't take any offense, but that don't really have a clear goal. They
Yeah,
don't have a clear goal of, I want to get stronger or I want to build muscle. I think it's for the people that lose interest real quick. And I think that part of losing interest real quick is not having a specific goal that you want to go for. They
yeah,
go hand in hand. So I don't see any benefit to daily undulating periodization. I guess not in terms of getting stronger or getting bigger, right? If you're
yeah.
someone that just wants to go to the gym and be healthy and be active, by all means, go for it, right? But don't expect to see a lot of great progress in either direction.
Yeah. I think it's just a less focused on any specific goal. There's nothing wrong with it, right?
Right.
If you want to be a jack of all trades and be decently strong, you want to be decently large and good at producing power. There's nothing wrong with that style of training.
No.
But I think I could design something better for growth over 8 weeks. I think I could design something better for strength over 8 weeks.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I think we always have to ask ourselves, okay, we have this period of time.
Hmm.
What's goal number one? Is there a goal number two? If there's a goal number two and the goal number two is strength, then have 2 hypertrophy days to 1 strength day.
Yeah.
And maybe you consider that undulating periodization. I would just say you create a ratio in your training of strength to hypertrophy favoring what your primary goal is, right?
Right. As long as you
So
can recover from it, and it's working
yeah.
towards. Um, well, with the last remaining little bit here, why don't you, what's going on with the USF lab? What are you guys focusing on right now? Any sort of interesting research that you've come across that you want to talk about?
Um, I mean, like I said, we've been writing a lot on periodization, and if you listen to this discussion today, uh, hopefully the stuff we talked about provides some clarity.
Yeah.
Um, I'm just I'm very very interested in moving the addressing the confusion in the literature to some extent, um, and better understanding how we program.
Yeah.
The research we're actually like the data we're collecting, we just had a paper come out on muscle size and strength in trained individuals. So if you've been training for any amount of time, is growth the reason you get stronger? Our data suggested that that's probably not the case.
Okay.
Um, so I don't think you need growth to get stronger, even as a trained individual, which is not what our textbooks would suggest.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're familiar with this idea, David, but your listeners may not be. Um, I believe that strength is driven by mechanisms that are largely independent of growth. Meaning, I don't think muscle growth is the primary reason that we get stronger.
Mhm.
And I also question whether growth drives strength at all, if it's a mechanism for strength. So we just published a study in clinical physiology and functional imaging,
Mhm.
um, and we're going to continue to pursue that line of thinking to understand growth better.
Yeah.
We just did a calf muscle growth study.
Ooh.
I can only speak a little bit on it, but we were interested in, calves are a muscle group that people have a hard time growing,
Yeah.
right? So we had people
Everybody's
lift
part of the Tiny
just,
Calves Club.
yeah. We had people lift just traditional calf raises and heavy calf raises,
Mhm.
and then the other condition did really lightweight with BFR.
Right.
And so the purpose of that is to see, you know, in a muscle that might be more difficult to grow, is there an opportunity to use BFR? Would that provide some advantage on maybe a more difficult to grow muscle?
Yeah.
So I can't speak to what we found yet. I know what we found,
Yeah.
but we'll have to maybe have another discussion in the future and talk
Absolutely.
about
When
that.
that thing gets published, we will bring you back on and talk, because calves, listen, I don't think that I have very much genetically gifted body parts, but my calves have always, now I used to play basketball, so I used to jump a lot.
Yeah,
My calves, like I don't hardly ever work my calves, and that's a very natural part. But I do know like so many people have trouble with it. And I've even had people ask me like, what do you do for your calves? Like, I don't work my calves. I don't do anything for it. Occasionally
yeah,
I'll get on like a donkey calf raise and jump on there because I like to feel that contraction, but I don't do anything for it. But it's really interesting, that idea of, can something like BFR help a stubborn body part more
yeah,
stuff.
yeah,
That's really interesting research that I want to see done more of and stuff.
yeah. And I kind of like those ideas and those questions, because like I have those thoughts in my head sometimes, like, yeah, this is difficult to grow. Maybe there's an
Yeah.
opportunity here, and um, I think those studies are kind of fun every once in a while. I do a lot of more just answering mechanistic questions. This is more of a question that at face value people seem to care about.
Are you
Um,
still are you still doing stuff with the new fit machine?
yes, yeah,
Yeah.
we wrapped up one study with that, and we're beginning another study ASAP. We just got approval for it. So,
Oh, that's awesome.
um,
That's great.
yeah, the new fit is obviously an emerging piece of technology that it's growing in popularity. More and more bodybuilders are using it. Mr. Olympias.
I'm actually using it to help rehab some of my injuries.
All right,
Yeah,
cool.
it's fantastic. Actually, I'm actually the guy that I work with. He's using a newer form of the new fit. It's a little bit different, but along the same lines. But
Okay.
it's tremendous. I mean, listen, I haven't really been able to train since like October.
Yeah.
Just dealing with injuries, foot surgery, shoulder, neck issues, and yeah, I go about once a week, try to get there twice a week sometimes. It's a little pricey sometimes when you have to go, to an
Yeah.
outside source. But guys, if you guys are going through rehab and stuff, this is an excellent choice. If you have an opportunity to go test it out, highly recommend it. And obviously Dr. Buckner's using it at the USF Muscle Lab
Yeah.
for some different studies and stuff. I'm excited to see what data you're coming out with, and definitely when these studies come out and you're able to talk about it, we're going to bring you back on it and talk a little bit more. But
Yeah.
where can people find you?
ResearchGate. No, that no one uses ResearchGate. I'm on all the usuals. I'm not super active, I'll be honest,
Yeah.
but I'm happy to engage in a discussion or conversation with anybody who wants to talk about muscle. Yeah, Instagram is fine. They can always shoot me an email. Through
I'll put
my
all your
just
stuff in the description below. But guys, I just have to tell you, I'm probably biased. Actually, I am biased, but I think I'm still telling the truth. USF, our master's program for exercise science at USF, is top notch. If you guys are interested, obviously, in learning how to build muscle and optimal strength, if you're interested in physique enhancement, we're one of the only real labs in the country that really focuses on physique enhancement. Excellent facilities, excellent faculty. Dr. Buckner's first year was my first year in the program too.
Yeah.
So we kind of came in together. You got professors like Dr. Campbell, Dr. Kilpatrick, who's more like cardio focused. You know, Dr. Martinez, he works a lot with the like psychological side of things. So just a great program. If you guys are interested in knowing more about the program, you can always contact me. Be more than happy. I even did a video talking about my experience in grad school on my YouTube channel you can check out, but I can't recommend it enough. Faculty's great. The opportunities that you get to do with conducting research there is amazing. And it's a very, very popular, well-known program. So highly suggest you check it out. But Dr. Buckner, it was great to catch up with you. It's been way too long, and it's just good to see you, man.
Yeah, same. Thanks for having me on.
Anytime. Guys, I will be back with another episode soon. You know the drill. Subscribe, share, all that stuff helps me tremendously. If you guys have any questions about anything we talked about, you can leave them down below, or you can shoot us a message and stuff, okay? Thank you, guys.